In a museum in the middle of Leeds, you can still see the skeleton of a woman who lost her life on the gallows more than 200 years ago. While she was alive, she sold fake cures and toxic powders to people who trusted her. After she was gone, strips of her skin were tanned like leather and sold as lucky charms. Her name was Mary Bateman, and she is only the beginning. Leeds looks like an ordinary northern city, full of quiet streets and normal lives, but hidden in its long history are some of the most shocking cases this country has ever known. Over the next while, the danger keeps changing shape, from poisoners and Victorian burglars to the 5 years of fear under the Yorkshire Ripper, to people who preyed on children, to weapons on modern streets. We are going to walk through 10 of them, one by one, in order, from 1809 right up to the present day. This is the dark history of Leeds. Section 1. Mary Bateman, the Yorkshire Witch. Leeds in the late 1700s was growing fast. Mills were going up, workers were pouring in from the countryside, and a quiet old town was turning into a loud industrial one. Into all that change walked a woman who would become one of the most talked about figures the city has ever produced. Her name was Mary Bateman. She was not born in Leeds. She came into the world around 1768 in Asenby, a village near Thirsk in North Yorkshire, into a farming family. As a young woman, she worked as a servant in Thirsk, but not for long. She was let go for stealing, and that set the shape of everything after. By her 20s, she was already living on small thefts and clever lies. In the late 1780s, she came to Leeds. In 1792, she married John Bateman, a man who made and mended wheels for a living, and the couple had children. To her neighbours, she looked like an ordinary wife who took in sewing. Behind that, she was running a very different kind of trade. Mary told people she had special powers. She set herself up as a fortune teller and a wise woman, the sort of person you visited when you were frightened, sick, or desperate. She used false names, and she invented people who never existed. The most useful was a woman she called Mrs. Blythe, said to live in Scarborough with even greater powers than Mary. Mrs. Blythe was pure fiction. Every letter that arrived from her was really written by Mary herself. One of her best-known tricks involved eggs. Word spread that one of her hens was laying eggs with writing on the shells, messages warning that the end of the world was near. People were frightened and fascinated, and they paid to see them. It was all staged. Mary marked the eggs herself. But it shows how she worked. She found what people feared most, then sold them comfort for a fee. For years no one stopped her, until the case that finally brought her down. A married couple came to her convinced a curse had been placed on the wife, Rebecca Perigo. They were exactly the trusting, worried people Mary looked for. She said the curse could be lifted by Mrs. Blythe, but only if they followed her orders exactly. First they sent clothing, then came demand after demand for money and goods, all supposedly for the cure. Across roughly 2 years, she stripped the couple of their savings and belongings. The worst came near the end. Mary gave them a powder with strict instructions: mix it into puddings, eat every last bit themselves, and let no one else taste it or know about it. The powder was toxic. Rebecca did as she was told and lost her life. William ate less of it and pulled through. Even then, Mary kept up the act. She told William his money was safe, sewn into his bedding for protection. When he finally cut it open, there was no money inside, only cabbage leaves. That was the moment the spell broke. He understood he had been robbed for years and that no one had ever been trying to save his wife. He went to the authorities, and a meeting with Mary was set up beside the canal in Leeds. That is where she was arrested. When officers searched her home, they found a toxic substance and items that had belonged to the people she had preyed on, the Perigos among them. Her trial was held at York in March 1809 before a judge named Sir Simon LeBlanc. The evidence stacked up fast. The letters from the invented Mrs. Blythe were in Mary's own hand, and the stolen goods were in her keeping. Her only defence was to deny everything. The jury did not need long. She was found guilty and condemned to the gallows. Mary still had one move left. She claimed she was expecting a child, knowing the law of the time would not carry out the sentence on a woman who was. A group of women examined her as the rules then demanded, and found it was not true. It was her final con, and it failed like all the rest. On March 20th, 1809, her sentence was carried out at York in front of a huge crowd. Some of the people watching still half believed she had real powers and would find a way to escape at the last second. She did not. Her story did not end on the scaffold. Her remains were carried back to Leeds, and crowds queued to see her. Around 2,500 people each paid 3 pence to look at the woman they had heard so much about. She was then handed to a leading Leeds surgeon, William Hay, for medical study. In a detail that feels almost impossible today, strips of her skin were tanned like leather and sold as lucky charms to keep evil away. The very superstition she had sold all her life was now being sold using what was left of her. Her skeleton is still in Leeds even now, kept at the Thackeray Medical Museum, where visitors learn her story more than 200 years on. Mary Bateman opens this list for a reason. She proves Leeds has lived with crimes that stunned the public for a very long time, long before television, modern newspapers, or true crime videos existed. And she shows a kind of harm that needs no weapon at all, only trust on one side and a patient liar on the other. The next name on this list arrived almost 70 years later, and he was about as different from Mary as you can get. He was no quiet woman with powders and letters, but the most wanted man in the whole country, a burglar whose break-ins ended with 2 lives lost. His long run from the law finally came to a stop inside a Leeds prison. Section 2. Charles Peace, the most wanted man in England. Mary Bateman used trust as her weapon. The next name on this list used the dark. He was a burglar, a master of breaking into homes at night, and for a while, he was the most wanted man in the whole country. His name was Charles Peace, and although the harm he caused happened in other cities, it was a Leeds prison where his story finally ended. Peace was born on the 14th of May 1832 in Darnell, near Sheffield. His father was a shoemaker. As a boy, he was hurt badly in an accident at a steelworks when a piece of hot metal went into his leg. He carried a limp for the rest of his life. That limp would later fool a lot of people because it made him look weak and harmless, which he most certainly was not. He grew into a career criminal. By day, he could pass for an ordinary, even respectable man. By night, he was one of the most skilled housebreakers Victorian England had seen, small, strong, and clever with his hands, able to climb and twist into places that should have been safe. For years, the police could not pin him down. His path turned much darker in 1876. One night that August, Peace was prowling around houses in the Warley Range area of Manchester when 2 policemen spotted him. As he tried to get away, he used the weapon he was carrying and ended the life of a young constable named Nicholas Cock. Peace slipped off into the night. Then something happened that says a lot about how the law worked back then. A local man called William Habron was arrested, put on trial, and wrongly convicted of the crime Peace had committed. An innocent man was condemned for something Charles Peace had done, while Peace himself walked free. Free, but not finished. He went back to the Sheffield area, where he became fixated on a married woman who lived nearby, the wife of a man named Arthur Dyson. The Dysons wanted nothing to do with him and tried to keep their distance. Peace would not let it go. Later that same year, the situation came to a head, and Peace ended Arthur Dyson's life. Now he was wanted in connection with a second life lost, and a reward of £100 was put up for his capture. What followed read like a story from a penny novel. Peace went on the run under false names, moved south to London, and carried out a long run of burglaries, using disguises and quick thinking to stay ahead of the police. For a time it worked, but late one night the law caught up with him during a break-in near Blackheath in London. He fought to get away and injured the officer who grabbed him, yet this time he was held. At first, the police did not even know who they had. He was tried at the Old Bailey in November 1878 under a false name, for the burglary and for trying to harm the officer, and he was sentenced to life behind bars. Soon after, his real identity came out, and with it, the charge that mattered most, the one for ending Arthur Dyson's life. In January 1879, Peace was put on a train and taken north to face it. Even then, he would not give up. On the journey, he threw himself from the moving train in a desperate attempt to escape. It did not work. He was recaptured and brought to Leeds. His trial began at Leeds on the 4th of February 1879, before a judge named Mr. Justice Lopez. The main witness against him was Mrs. Dyson, the very woman his fixation had centred on, who told the court how her husband had lost his life. The evidence was strong. The weapon found on Peace when he was caught in London matched the one used against Arthur Dyson. The jury barely needed to think. After about 10 minutes they found him guilty, and he was condemned to the gallows. He was held at Armley Jail in Leeds to await the end. On 25th February 1879, his sentence was carried out there. The man who saw it through was William Marwood, well known across the country for that grim job. Beforehand, Peace said it was for something he had done but never intended. He also did one last surprising thing. He confessed that he, not William Habron, had ended Constable Cock's life in Manchester. Because of that confession, Habron, who had been locked away for a crime he did not commit, was given a free pardon and £800 in compensation. After he was gone, Charles Peace did not fade away. If anything, he grew larger. A waxwork of Peace and the man who carried out his sentence went on show at Madame Tussauds. Cheap books and pamphlets told and retold his life, and in the early days of cinema, films were even made about him. The clever, limping burglar who slipped through windows and outran the police became a strange kind of folk legend, half feared and half admired. That is the strange thing about his place on a list of notorious Leeds cases. The lives he took were taken in Manchester and Sheffield, not in Leeds. Leeds is where he was tried, where he was held, and where his long, lawless life finally ran out. For a man who spent years escaping every trap, it was a Leeds courtroom and a Leeds prison that closed the door on him for good. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes us forward almost 50 years into the Leeds of the 1920s. It is the story of a woman taken in as a lodger by an older widow and of a life lost in that shared home that sent the lodger to the gallows. Even now, not everyone is sure the right person was blamed. Section 3. Louie Calvert, the lodger and the widow. The first two names on this list were a poisoner and a burglar. The third is something rarer in British history, a woman sent to the gallows. Her name was Louie Calvert, and her story is built on lies stacked on top of lies, until one of them finally collapsed. Louie was a Yorkshire woman with a long history of small crimes. She often worked as a housekeeper for other families, and wherever she went, things had a habit of going missing. She would take items and pawn them for cash. But theft was only part of it. The thing Louie was truly good at was lying about herself, and the biggest lie of her life involved a baby that did not exist. At some point, Louie convinced a man named Arthur Calvert that she was expecting his child. On the strength of that, he married her. It was not the first time she had used a pretend pregnancy to get what she wanted. The problem with a lie like that is simple. Sooner or later, people expect to see a baby. So Louie came up with a plan. She told Arthur she was going away to stay near Dewsbury until the birth. In truth, she went to lodge in Leeds, in the home of an older widow named Lily Waterhouse, on Amberley Road in the New Workley area. Her real plan was to get hold of a baby some other way, then return to her husband and present the child as their own. She had even lined up an infant she could take in. To make the story work, all she had to do was disappear for a while and come back a mother. For a short time, the two women lived together under one roof, the lodger and the widow. But the arrangement turned sour. By the end of March 1926, whatever trust had existed between them was gone. On the evening of 31st of March 1926, inside that shared house, Lily Waterhouse lost her life. When she was found, there were marks around her neck, a piece of string had been placed over her feet, and there were marks on her wrists as though something had been pulled tight around them. What is striking is how the discovery happened. Police did not arrive because anyone had raised the alarm about Lily. They came to the house about an entirely different matter and walked into the aftermath of a terrible crime. Suspicion fell on Louie almost at once. Neighbours had heard strange sounds from the home that evening, and Louie had been seen leaving. She came back the next day, which was a strange thing to do. 2 days after the crime, on April 2nd, 1926, she was arrested, and here came the detail that would help seal her fate. When officers took her in, She was wearing a pair of boots that had belonged to Lily Waterhouse. Those missing boots did more than connect Louie to the widow. They reached back into the past and reopened an old mystery. 4 years earlier, in 1922, a man named John William Frobisher had been found in the water in Leeds. Frobisher was a former employer of Louie, a man whose housekeeper she had once been under a different name. When he was found, one odd thing stood out. His boots were gone. At the time, the official conclusion was that he had ended up in the water and lost his life there, with no blame placed on anyone. Now, with a second case and another pair of missing boots, people looked again. While she was held and waiting after her conviction, Louie admitted that she had been responsible for Frobisher's end too. A small theft of footwear, repeated years apart, had quietly linked 2 separate cases together. Louie was put on trial and convicted for what had happened to Lily Waterhouse. Facing the gallows, she reached for the same trick that had worked for her before. She claimed she was expecting a child because the law would not carry out the sentence on a woman who truly was. As with Mary Bateman more than a century earlier, the claim was checked and found to be false. The lie that had once won her a husband could not save her now. Her sentence was not carried out in Leeds, even though her crimes belonged to the city. She was taken across to Strangeways Prison in Manchester, and there, on the 24th of June 1926, her life ended. She was one of only a small number of women in that era to face such a fate. There is one more twist worth mentioning, and it keeps the case alive even today. Not everyone is convinced that Louie Calvert was guilty of everything she was blamed for. A crime writer and historian named Stephen Wade studied the case closely and came away with serious doubts, especially about the older Frobisher matter. He pointed out simple, practical problems. Louie was a small woman, and the idea that she could move a grown man any real distance to the water on her own is hard to believe. Details about where Frobisher was found in the water did not sit neatly with the story either. The case was later revisited on television, with families and experts looking again at whether the verdict was truly safe. That uncertainty is part of what makes Louie Calvert worth remembering. She was a liar and a thief, that much is beyond doubt. But whether every charge laid against her was fair is a question that still has no clean answer. The next case jumps forward to 1961 and to one of the city's well-off suburbs, where a break-in went badly wrong. It would lead to the very last time the gallows inside a Leeds prison were ever used. After that, this particular chapter of Leeds history was closed for good. Section 4. Zigga Pancotia, the last to hang at Armley. By 1961, Britain was starting to turn away from one of the oldest punishments it had. For around 100 years, the prison at Armley in Leeds had been a place where the worst offenders met their end. Crowds had once gathered outside its walls in their thousands. Charles Peace had taken his final steps inside it back in 1879. But attitudes were changing fast, and the gallows were used less and less. This section is about the very last person ever to face them at Armley, and the rather ordinary crime that put him there. The story begins in Roundhay, one of the smarter, wealthier suburbs of Leeds. On a quiet street called Chelwood Avenue, just off Street Lane, lived a man named Jack Eli Myers. Myers was 50 years old and made his living as a market trader. By the standards of the area, he was a man who had done well. The year before, he had enjoyed a stroke of good luck, winning a large sum on the football pools, well over £1,000, which in today's money would be close to £30,000. And Myers was not shy about it. He liked to tell his customers about his win. That habit may have cost him everything. Word of a man with money is exactly the kind of word that travels to the wrong ears. Early in 1961, a man broke into the house on Chelwood Avenue. His name was Zigga Pancotia, sometimes written Pancotai. He was 31 years old, Hungarian-born, and worked as a coal miner. He had come for Myers' money and belongings, expecting an empty house. He was wrong. While Pancotia was inside, Jack Eli Myers came home, far earlier than the burglar had bargained for. What followed was not quick. The two men ended up in a long, drawn-out struggle that is said to have lasted around 25 minutes. Pancotia seized a weapon that was in the house, and at one point even a chair was used. By the time it was over, Jack Eli Myers had lost his life inside his own home. Pancotia fled, but he did not get away clean. He was later found in possession of items that had belonged to Myers, and that link helped tie him to the crime. When the case came to court, Pancotia's defence tried an unusual argument. They did not deny that he had been in the house. Instead, they claimed that Myers had a weak heart and that it had failed on its own during the confrontation, rather than because of anything Pancotia had done. It was a bold line to take. The jury did not accept it. Here is where the timing of the case becomes important. Just a few years earlier, the law in Britain had changed. Under the rules in force at the time, taking a person's life during a robbery or theft was treated as one of the most serious crimes of all, the kind that could carry the ultimate sentence. Because Myers had lost his life during a break-in for money and goods, Pancotia's case fell squarely into that category. He was tried, convicted and sentenced at Leeds Assizes, which at that time sat inside Leeds Town Hall. The conviction came on 26 April 1961. Unlike many in his position, Pancotia chose not to appeal the decision. He accepted what was coming. On Thursday, 29 June 1961, his sentence was carried out at Armley Jail. The man who saw it through was Harry Allen, one of the country's official figures for such matters. It was the first time the punishment had been used in Leeds since 1959. More importantly, it was the last. Zigga Pancotia became the final person ever to be put to such an end inside Armley, closing a chapter that had been open for well over a century. In one sense, his case was almost unremarkable. A break-in that turned into a struggle when the owner came home is a sad story, but not a rare one. There was no great mystery, no famous detective work, no twist that gripped the nation for years. What makes Pancotia matter is the line he sits on in history. He is the full stop at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. Think back across this list so far. Mary Bateman in 1809, Charles Peace in 1879, Louie Calvert in 1926. For more than 150 years, the worst crimes in and around Leeds had often ended on the gallows, and Armley had played its grim part in that story. Pancotia is where all of that stops. Within a few short years of his case, Britain moved away from this punishment for good. The rope was retired. The trapdoor at Armley fell silent. So when people talk about the most notorious cases in the city's past, Pancotia rarely gets the same attention as the names that came before or after him. His crime did not shock the world, but for anyone interested in how Leeds, and Britain, dealt with its most serious offenders, his is one of the most important cases of all. He marks the exact moment an old way of doing justice came to an end inside the walls of a Leeds prison. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cases so far have each been a single crime, one offender and one terrible event. The next is nothing like that. It is a string of crimes that stretched across 5 years, spread fear through every street in Leeds, and still stands as the darkest chapter in the entire history of the city. Section 5. The Yorkshire Ripper. 5 years of fear in Leeds. If there is one case at the centre of this list, it is this one. Between 1975 and 1980, a man moved through the north of England targeting women, and for 5 long years he could not be stopped. He became known by a chilling nickname, the Yorkshire Ripper. Of the 13 lives he took, 6 were taken in Leeds, more than in any other city. For the people living there at the time, those years left a mark that has never fully faded. The man behind it all looked like nobody special. His name was Peter Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bradford. He was married, quiet, and easy to overlook, and that ordinariness was exactly what let him hide in plain sight for so long. His path through Leeds began in the autumn of 1975. The first life he took was that of Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother, in the Chapeltown area in October. At the time, Chapeltown was known as the part of Leeds where women worked the streets at night, and several of the women he targeted early on came from that world. In January 1976, he took the life of Emily Jackson, 42. In February 1977 came Irene Richardson, 28. Then, in June 1977, something changed that turned fear into panic. He took the life of Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old from Leeds. Jane had nothing to do with the streets. She was an ordinary local teenager walking home, and losing her made one terrible thing clear to everyone in the city. No woman, of any age or any background, was safe. The fear that had been limited to one part of Leeds now spread everywhere. It did not end there. In August 1980, he took the life of Marguerite Walls, who was 47. The last woman whose life he took came in November 1980, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student at Leeds University. By then the whole country was watching, and even the Prime Minister was demanding results. To understand how he got away with it for so long, you have to picture how policing worked back then. The huge investigation was run from Millgarth Police Station in the centre of Leeds. This was a time before computers, so every scrap of information was written on index cards and stored by hand. So much paper piled up that the floor of the incident room had to be strengthened to hold the weight. Somewhere in that mountain of files was Sutcliffe's own name. He was spoken to by officers and let go 9 separate times. 2 things kept him free. The first was how normal he seemed. The second was a cruel trick played on the investigation by a complete stranger. In 1978 and 1979, police received letters and a tape from a man claiming to be the one they were hunting. He spoke with a strong northeast accent from the Sunderland area. The team became convinced it was real and shifted the whole search towards the northeast. An instruction even told detectives to set aside any suspect who did not have that accent. Sutcliffe, with his Yorkshire voice, no longer fitted the picture. It was all a lie. The tape and letters were the work of a hoaxer, later named as John Humble, who was not the offender at all. While police chased a voice that belonged to the wrong man, the real one stayed free, and during that wasted time, 3 more women lost their lives. Years later, Humble was traced through advances in forensic science and sent to prison. In the end, Sutcliffe was not caught by the great investigation. He was caught by luck. On January 2nd, 1981, 2 ordinary officers in Sheffield stopped a car parked with a woman inside. A check showed false number plates, and Sutcliffe was taken in. While being held, he slipped away briefly and hid the items he had been carrying. The next day, officers returned and found them. Faced with that, he began to confess, calmly listing the women whose lives he had taken. He was convicted of 13 counts of taking a life, and 7 more for harming women who survived, and given a sentence meaning he would never be released. By the time he was caught, the gallows that ended Section 4 of this list were long gone from Britain, so he spent the rest of his days behind bars. He passed away in late 2020. What lingers most is not just what he did, but what swirled around it. As the panic grew, a sickening kind of myth-making took hold, with his nickname chanted at football matches as if it were a joke. That enraged the women of Leeds, who were the ones living in real fear. They organised marches through the city, demanding the right to walk their own streets at night. There was also deep anger at how police and press had spoken about the women, treating some as innocent and quietly suggesting others were not. This is why the Yorkshire Ripper case stands as the darkest chapter in the city's history. It was not only a string of terrible crimes, it changed how Leeds and Britain thought about the safety of women and the failures of those meant to protect them. The fear in this chapter was the fear of grown women walking home at night. The next case brought a different and even harder kind of fear, the kind that involves a child of just 10 years old, a short errand to a local shop, and a man who roamed the roads of Britain searching for children. It remains one of the most heartbreaking cases ever linked to the city. Section 6. Sarah Harper, the short walk home. The last case was about the fear that hung over grown women in Leeds. This one is about a fear that cuts even deeper, the fear every parent carries for a child. It is the story of a 10-year-old girl, an errand that should have taken 2 minutes, and a man who treated the roads of Britain as his hunting ground. Her name was Sarah Jane Harper. She lived with her family on Brunswick Place in Morley, a town that sits within the wider Leeds area. On the evening of 26 March 1986, a Wednesday, Sarah was sent on a small, everyday job. She was to walk to the corner shop, less than 100 yards from her front door, to fetch a loaf of bread. She pulled on her shoes and headed out into the dark. It was a journey she had surely made many times. The shop was close enough to see from near her home, but on the way back, walking through the alleyway that led to her street, Sarah was snatched. It happened at around 5 to 8 in the evening, only meters from her own front door. In the time it takes to walk to the end of a road, she was gone. What followed was every family's nightmare. Sarah did not come home. A search began, but there was no sign of her. 4 long weeks passed with no answer. Then, around 70 miles away, on the 19th of April 1986, a person walking their dog found her in the River Trent, near Nottingham. An examination later showed she had been harmed before she lost her life in the water. Forensic work suggested she had been placed in the river not far from the M1, the major motorway linking Leeds with the south of England. That detail about the motorway mattered more than anyone realised at the time. Whoever had taken Sarah had not stayed local. He had carried her far from Leeds and left the trail miles away, in another county entirely. It pointed to someone who lived on the road, someone for whom long distances was simply part of the day. But in 1986, the police did not yet have a name. That name was Robert Black. He was a Scottish-born man who worked as a delivery driver, and his job is the key to understanding how he got away with so much for so long. Driving took him all over the United Kingdom, from Scotland to the south of England and across to Northern Ireland. He was a man who preyed on children, and his van gave him both a way to find young ones far from his own home and a way to move the trail hundreds of miles before anyone knew what had happened. Those who studied his case would later describe him as the living shape of every parent's nightmare. For years, he was a shadow with no face. Then, in 1990, his luck finally ran out, and it happened because of one alert member of the public. In the Scottish village of Stow, a man noticed something deeply wrong, a small girl being bundled into a van. He had the presence of mind to write down the van's number plate and call the police at once. When officers stopped the van, they found a 6-year-old girl hidden inside. She was still alive. Because of that quick-thinking witness, she was rescued, and Robert Black was finally caught. His arrest opened the floodgates. Police forces across the country began comparing notes, and a pattern emerged that stretched back years and crossed the whole of Britain. In 1994, Black was put on trial and convicted of taking the lives of 3 children. One of them was Sarah Harper. The others were Susan Maxwell, an 11-year-old from Northumberland, taken in 1982, and Caroline Hogg, a 5-year-old from the Edinburgh area, taken in 1983. He was also found responsible for a failed attempt to seize a child in Nottingham in 1988. For all of this, he was handed a string of life sentences. The reckoning did not stop there. In 2011, more than 30 years after the event, Black was convicted of yet another case, the taking of 9-year-old Jennifer Cardy in Northern Ireland back in 1981. By then it was clear that he had been one of the most dangerous men the country had ever produced, and police believe he may have been responsible for others who were never officially tied to him. He remained, for example, a leading suspect in the long unsolved disappearance of a teenager named Jeanette Tate. Robert Black never walked free again. He spent the rest of his life behind bars and passed away in prison in 2016. For Leeds, and for Morley in particular, the case has never really gone away. Out of everything Black did across the country, it is that short walk in Morley that lingers, the few steps between a little girl's front door and a corner shop that she never managed to walk back. People who live nearby still point to the spot, decades on. It is a quiet, ordinary stretch of pavement, and that is exactly what makes it so hard to forget. A child should be able to fetch a loaf of bread and come home. Sarah Harper could not, and the reason was a stranger passing through with a van and terrible intentions. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case carries a painful echo of this one. 14 years later, in another part of Leeds, another young person would set off on a short journey home and never arrive. The search that followed would grow into one of the largest the local force had ever mounted. Section 7. Leanne Tieran, hidden in plain sight. 14 years after Sarah Harper, Leeds faced another case that began the same heartbreaking way, with a young person setting off on a short, ordinary journey and never making it home. This time the year was 2000, the place was Bramley, and the person was a 16-year-old schoolgirl named Leanne Tieran. It was 26th November 2000, and Leanne had been out doing some Christmas shopping in Leeds with a friend. As the evening drew in, she made her way back towards home, less than a mile away. Part of her route took her along a quiet, unlit path that cut through a wooded area in Bramley. It was the kind of shortcut local people used without a second thought. Somewhere along that path, Leanne was taken. The man who took her was John Taylor, and he did not have far to go. He lived close by. He forced Leanne to his home, where he bound her hands and covered her eyes, and there he took her life. What he did next is one of the coldest details in this entire list. Rather than move her straight away, Taylor hid Leanne in a freezer inside his own home, and he kept her there for around 9 months. Police later said he did this partly to avoid being caught, and partly as a kind of trophy. While Leanne lay hidden, her family lived through an agony with no end in sight. Her disappearance set off one of the biggest searches West Yorkshire police had ever carried out. Officers worked through around 1,750 buildings. They examined dozens of drains. At one point, they drained a 2-mile stretch of canal, hoping it might hold an answer. They took DNA samples from about 200 people connected to the area. For month after month, all of it led nowhere. Because the answer was sitting quietly in a freezer in Bramley, in a house officers had no reason to suspect. The truth only began to surface in the summer of 2001. By then, for reasons of his own, Taylor had finally moved Leanne out of the freezer and buried her in dense woodland near Otley, around 16 miles from her home. On August 20th, 2001, she was found there, close to a busy car park, almost by chance. After 9 long months, Leanne's family at last knew the terrible truth. Finding her was one thing, proving who was responsible was another, and this is where the case made history. There were no eyewitnesses to the moment Leanne was taken. What caught John Taylor was science. Tiny pieces of forensic evidence, including DNA, tied him to Leanne and to the path where she had vanished. The work was painstaking, but it was enough. The trail led straight to a local postman, a man who had spent years moving quietly around the very streets where families felt safe. In July 2002, at Leeds Crown Court, John Taylor admitted that he had taken Leanne's life. The judge who sentenced him did not hold back, describing Taylor as a sadist and handed him a life sentence. To the public, the most disturbing part was how unremarkable he had seemed. He was not a stranger passing through, like the man in the Sarah Harper case. He was a familiar local face, the sort of person you might nod to in the street. The investigation did not close with that conviction. As detectives kept digging into Taylor's past, a far darker history came to light. In 2003, he was convicted of further serious crimes against women, which brought him additional life sentences. Years later, he admitted to a string of other offences against women and girls, stretching back across the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. For decades, he had hidden a second life behind the ordinary one his neighbours saw. Because of that long, hidden record, some investigators have since asked a troubling question. They have wondered whether Taylor might be connected to other cases that were never solved, including the disappearances of several women in the wider Yorkshire area over the years. It is important to be clear that this remains a theory rather than proven fact. Taylor has not been charged in those cases, and they stay officially open. But the very fact that experienced officers take the idea seriously tells you how dangerous they believe he truly was. For Leeds, the Leanne Tieran case left 2 lasting marks. The first is simple grief, the loss of a 16-year-old girl who did nothing more than walk home from a shopping trip. The second is the way the case changed police work. It became one of the most important examples in Britain of forensic science solving a crime that older methods could not. The small, almost invisible clues that tied Taylor to Leanne helped show how powerful that kind of evidence could be, and it has shaped serious investigations ever since. Leanne's story is a reminder of something uncomfortable. The danger in these cases is not always a faceless outsider. Sometimes it is the man with the familiar job and the friendly nod, the one nobody thinks to look at twice. And that is exactly what makes a case like this so hard to shake. The next case takes place just 3 years later, but it could hardly be more different. There was no long search, no one hidden away for months. Instead, on a single winter morning, in plain daylight, a routine check on a parked car ended with the life of a Leeds police officer being taken and set off a manhunt that spread across the whole country. Section 8. Police Constable Ian Broadhurst. A routine stop on Boxing Day. The last case unfolded slowly, over 9 long months. This one was over in seconds. It happened just 3 years later, on Boxing Day, 26 December 2003, in the Oakwood area of Leeds, and it took the life of a serving police officer doing one of the most ordinary parts of his job. His name was Police Constable Ian Broadhurst. He was 34 years old and worked as a traffic officer with West Yorkshire Police. On that quiet Boxing Day, he and 2 colleagues, PC Neil Roper and PC James Banks, were checking on a car parked on Dib Lane. There was nothing unusual about it on the surface. The car had drawn their attention because it was showing false number plates, and looking into it was simple routine. Officers do this kind of thing every single day without a second thought. But the man connected to that car was not an ordinary motorist. He was David Bieber, and without warning he pulled out a weapon. In the space of a few terrible seconds, PC Broadhurst was struck and fell to the ground, badly hurt. Bieber did not stop there. He turned the weapon on PC Roper, leaving him injured, and then aimed at Police Constable Banks as well. By sheer chance, the weapon failed at that moment, and Police Constable Banks survived. Police Constable Ian Broadhurst, though, lost his life at the scene. Then Bieber fled. The shock of it was enormous. A police officer losing his life in this way was extremely rare. In fact, PC Broadhurst was the first officer to lose his life in this manner on the British mainland in around 10 years. A simple roadside check on a sleepy holiday morning had turned into one of the darkest days in the recent history of West Yorkshire Police. For the officers who knew him, and for the wider force, it was a wound that would never fully heal. The next question was obvious. Who was David Bieber, and where had he gone? The answers turned out to be remarkable. Bieber was not a local at all. He was an American, a former United States Marine, and a serious bodybuilder, and he had been living in Britain under a false name. Back in the United States, he was a wanted man, sought in connection with a grave case in Florida. He had crossed the Atlantic and built a hidden life under a new identity, and almost nobody around him knew the truth. With Bieber on the run, West Yorkshire Police launched one of the biggest searches the force had ever mounted. For a time, he managed to stay ahead of them, moving around the country, but the net slowly closed. In the end, he was tracked down and arrested. The man who had taken a police officer's life in seconds was finally in custody. His trial took place the following year. In December 2004, David Bieber was convicted of taking PC Broadhurst's life and of the harm he had caused the other 2 officers, and he was handed life behind bars. At first, the trial judge ordered that he should never be released at all, the most severe sentence the law allowed. Later, in 2008, a higher court changed that. They replaced the never-to-be-released order with a minimum term of 37 years, meaning Bieber could one day, far in the future, at least be considered for release. Even prison did not put an end to his capacity to do harm. Years later, in 2017, while serving his sentence, Bieber deliberately injured a prison officer using a homemade weapon he had obtained. For that, he was convicted of a serious assault and, in 2022, given a second life sentence. It confirmed what the people who dealt with him had always believed. He was, and remained, an extremely dangerous man. For Leeds, the loss of PC Broadhurst struck a deep nerve. Here was a man whose entire job was to keep ordinary people safe, taken from his family on a holiday morning while doing routine work. He was not the first officer the city had lost in the line of duty either. Back in 1984, a sergeant named John Speed had lost his life near Leeds Minster, another reminder that policing a city carries real and serious dangers. After the loss of PC Broadhurst, the city made sure he would not be forgotten. A memorial now stands on Dib Lane, close to where it all happened, and services have been held in his honour at Leeds Minster, the same church where his funeral took place in early 2004. What makes this case sit so heavily is how little warning there was. The earlier cases on this list involved planning, hiding, and long stretches of time. This one was the opposite. It was sudden, almost senseless, the result of a routine check colliding with a desperate and dangerous man who decided in an instant to do the unthinkable. A few moments of ordinary work cost a good officer his life and left 2 of his colleagues with memories no one should ever have to carry. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case keeps us in modern Leeds, but moves the danger onto the city's own streets. It is not about a fugitive from another country. Instead, it deals with the rise of gang trouble and street crime in parts of the city, and a young man whose life was taken in broad daylight, right outside a local barber shop. Section 9. Raheem Wilks, targeted in broad daylight. The cases before this one stretched back across the centuries. This one belongs firmly to modern Leeds, and it shows how the dangers in a city can change. There was no poisoner, no fugitive from abroad, no lone figure hiding a secret. Instead, there was a gang, a turf dispute, and a young man whose life was taken in the middle of the afternoon outside a barber shop in front of witnesses. His name was Raheem Wilks, and he was just 19 years old. On 26th January 2017, he was outside Two Sharps Barbers on Gathorne Terrace in the Hare Hills area of Leeds. It was the middle of the day, around lunchtime. He was targeted there, suffered a single serious injury, and was rushed to hospital. Despite emergency surgery, Raheem lost his life later that same day. To many people in the city, the name Wilks was already familiar. Raheem was the brother of Malik Wilks, a footballer who would go on to play for Leeds United. But Raheem moved in very different circles. He was a member of a Leeds gang known as the Flock, and that connection is at the heart of why he was targeted. The Flock was a real and serious problem in parts of the city. It was a gang tied up in turf disputes and the illegal trade that fuels so much street crime, made up largely of young men, some still in their teens. Its members were known for showing off their lifestyle on social media. Against that background, what happened to Raheem was not random. He was singled out on purpose. Months earlier, one of the men who would later be convicted had himself been targeted in a similar way and believed the Flock was behind it. To investigators, the loss of Raheem looked like revenge, a deliberate act meant to send a message. The way it was carried out showed planning rather than panic. A group of men were tipped off about where Raheem could be found. They drove to the area, and the act was done. The man the prosecution described as almost certainly the one who used the weapon was named Jaden Manners. Afterwards, he drove away to Bradford and got rid of the weapon and his clothing, trying to bury any trace of what he had done. Under the law, everyone who plays a part in this kind of planned act can be held responsible, not only the person who strikes the final blow. But here the case ran into a wall that police know all too well. The crime happened in daylight, in a public place, with people around. And yet, when officers asked for help, nobody who had been present was willing to come forward. This silence, often born of fear, is one of the hardest parts of dealing with gang-related crime. The people most likely to know the truth are the ones least willing to say it out loud. So detectives had to build their case another way. They gathered and studied huge amounts of CCTV footage. They pored over phone records and social media accounts. One of the most striking pieces of evidence came from a video one of the group recorded shortly after the event, in which he appeared to celebrate, reciting lines from a rap song about exactly this kind of act. Piece by piece, the digital trail did what frightened witnesses would not. It tied the group to the crime. The case came to trial at Leeds Crown Court in late 2017. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its verdicts in just over 2 hours. 3 men were found responsible for taking Raheem's life. Jaden Manners, Keel Richards and Tremaine Wisdom were each given a life sentence, with a minimum of 33 years behind bars before they could even be considered for release. 2 other people who had been accused were found not guilty and walked free. For Leeds, the Raheem Wilks case marked a different chapter from most of the others on this list. The earlier cases were the work of lone individuals, people acting in the shadows on their own. This was something more modern and in its own way just as worrying. It involved groups of young men, weapons on the streets, codes of silence, and a kind of dark bragging played out on phone screens. It was a glimpse of how serious crime in a modern city can spread through whole networks rather than single minds. The human cost was plain to see. Raheem was 19, with a footballer brother and a future ahead of him, and instead, his family found themselves planning a funeral. Hundreds of people came to that service, held at St Aidan's Church in Hare Hills in the April that followed, to say goodbye to a young man whose life ended far too soon on a Leeds pavement. Perhaps the saddest part is that the harm did not stop with him. Years later, the same family was touched by tragedy once more, when another of Raheem's brothers was convicted over a separate case in the city in which a young person lost their life. It was a grim reminder of how this kind of street crime can pull in family after family, and how hard the cycle is to break once it takes hold. The final case on this list is the most recent of them all, and in some ways the hardest to sit with, because it involves children. It centres on a 15-year-old who lost his life and a 14-year-old who was responsible, outside a school, in plain view of other young people. It is a story that forced Leeds and the whole country to ask some very uncomfortable questions. Section 10. Alfie Lewis, the youngest tragedy of all. This is the final case on the list, and in many ways it is the hardest to talk about. The cases so far have involved adults, fugitives, gangs, and lone offenders. This one involved children. The young person who lost his life was just 15. The young person responsible was only 14. It happened in Horsforth, a quiet, well-regarded part of Leeds, on an ordinary school afternoon in late 2023. The boy who lost his life was Alfie Lewis. He was 15 years old. On Tuesday, 7th November 2023, just before 3 o'clock, Alfie was walking through Horsforth on his way to meet some friends. It was the end of the school day, and the streets were full of the usual rush of young people heading home, near a local primary school. By every account, Alfie was doing nothing more than walking down the road, with no idea of what was about to happen. Then another boy, aged 14, approached him. Without any real provocation, he pushed Alfie to the ground and harmed him twice, using a weapon he had earlier taken from a kitchen drawer in his own home. All of this happened in plain sight, in front of a crowd of children and school staff who were leaving for the day. Witnesses remembered Alfie looking shocked and confused, and heard him ask the other boy what he was doing. Alfie was rushed to hospital, but his injuries were too severe, and he lost his life a short time later. The boy responsible was named Bateman Shujafard. Because of his age, he could not be identified during the trial, but the basic facts came out clearly in court. The two boys had crossed paths before. There had been 2 earlier incidents between them, one during the summer and one around Halloween. Shujafard claimed that he had been frightened of Alfie because of these run-ins, and that he had carried the weapon and used it only to protect himself. He denied that it was a deliberate act. The jury did not believe him. They listened to the witnesses, weighed the evidence, and decided that this was no act of self-defence. After a 2-week trial at Leeds Crown Court, in May 2024, Bateman Shujafard was found guilty of taking Alfie's life. Police were clear about one thing in particular. Alfie was not part of any gang. He was not involved in crime of any kind. He was, in their words, completely defenceless. An ordinary teenager caught up in something he had no part in starting. In June 2024, the sentence was passed. Shujafard was ordered to be detained for life, with a minimum of 13 years before he could even be considered for release. At the same hearing, the judge lifted the rules that had kept the boy's name secret. He decided that naming him would help an important public conversation, the growing national worry about young people carrying weapons on the streets. For the people of Horsforth and the wider city, the effect was profound. Alfie's family were left to face a future without him. They wore shirts bearing his picture and the words, "Forever 15." A memorial was set up in his memory, and his loved ones turned their grief into action, speaking out and joining wider efforts across West Yorkshire to tackle the problem of young people and weapons. The region's mayor pointed to a new strategy aimed at tackling serious harm, and a blunt message went out to young people about the terrible consequences of choosing to carry a weapon. The hope, again and again, was a simple one. No other family should have to go through this. But even the ending of this case brought fresh pain. Because the boy was so young when it happened, the rules allow him to ask for his sentence to be looked at again after he has served only half of it, which could come as early as the start of the next decade. For Alfie's mother, the idea that the boy responsible might one day walk free while her son never can was almost impossible to bear. She made her feelings plain, calling the situation deeply unfair. It is a reminder that even after a conviction, the wounds left by a case like this do not simply close. This is where the list ends, and it is a sobering place to finish. Across these 10 cases, the dangers have changed shape many times over. We began more than 200 years ago with a woman selling fake cures and toxic powders. We have moved through Victorian burglars, a lodger and her landlady, the long shadow of the Yorkshire Ripper, people who preyed on children, and the rise of weapons on modern streets. And we end here, with 2 boys, a kitchen drawer, and a school afternoon that should have been entirely unremarkable. What makes the Alfie Lewis case land so hard is exactly how ordinary the setting was. There was no master criminal, no years of planning, no hidden double life. There was just a teenager walking to meet his friends, and another teenager who had decided to carry a weapon. In a single moment, one young life was over, and another was ruined. It is the most modern case on this list, and perhaps the clearest sign of how the threats facing a city can shift from one generation to the next. From 1809 right up to the present day, these 10 cases trace how a city's fears change with the times, from a woman selling toxic powders to people who trusted her, through Victorian burglars and the long fear of the Yorkshire Ripper, to children carrying weapons in our own decade. The faces change, but the threads stay the same. So often the danger wore an ordinary face, a trusted neighbour or a local postman, rather than an obvious monster. The way Leeds caught them changed too, from the public gallows to the quiet power of forensic science and a single piece of CCTV. But the thread that matters most is the simplest one. Behind every case is a person who did not come home, and it is their names, not the names of the people who harmed them, that deserve to be remembered. That, in the end, is what a city's memory is really for. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.